My family spent 30 years treating me like a stranger in my own home. But when a woman I'd never met left me $12 million, they suddenly remembered my name. What they didn't know was that the money wasn't a gift. It was a trap I'd been waiting to spring. The smell of expensive lilies, that cloying, bittersweet scent of funeral flowers and old money, always makes my jaw tighten now. It was the only thing I could breathe in as I sat in the back corner of Mr. Sterling's law office. The room was a tomb of mahogany and heavy velvet curtains that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the air. I looked at my family. They weren't mourning. They were vibrating with a sickening kind of greed. My older sister, Claire, was busy checking her reflection in her phone screen, smoothing down a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My mother sat front and center, her spine as rigid as a frozen lake, already wearing a look of practiced grief that didn't quite reach her hungry eyes. Even my cousins, people I hadn't heard from since I was a teenager, had crawled out of the woodwork, whispering in the corners like vultures waiting for a carcass to be unveiled. They didn't even acknowledge me. To them, I was just Arlette, the family's resident failure, the one who worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over her head while they spent their weekends at the country club. I could see the way they looked at me out of the corners of their eyes, pity mixed with a smug satisfaction that I was finally in a room where I truly didn't belong. They were all here for the grand inheritance of a woman named Evelyn Vance. A woman they claimed was a distant, eccentric relative. A woman I was told I had never even met. The air in the room didn't just feel thin anymore, it felt electric, like the moment right before a lightning strike. When I mentioned my birth certificate, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of a guilty conscience finally being cornered. My father's hand, which had been pointing at the will, slowly dropped to his side. He looked at my mother, searching for a script, a lie, anything to stop the bleeding. But for the first time in her life, my mother was speechless. Her mouth was open, her perfectly applied lipstick smeared as she struggled to find words. "What are you talking about, Arlette?" Claire snapped, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She looked between us, her brow furrowed. "Your name is Arlette Davis. It's always been Arlette Davis. Stop trying to turn this into some cheap soap opera because you're greedy." I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on my father. "Is it, Dad? Is that the name on the original filing? Or is that just the name you paid a clerk in a small-town courthouse to type over the real one?" I pulled a yellowed, fragile piece of paper from the envelope. It wasn't the fancy, embossed document they had shown me for school registrations or passport renewals. It was a hospital record from a clinic 3 states away, dated 30 years ago. "Evelyn Vance didn't leave $12 million to a stranger," I said, my voice gaining a cold, hard edge. "She left it to her daughter. The one who was taken from her because her presence threatened a multi-million-dollar merger between the Davis and Miller families. She left it to the baby you bought to save your reputation." My mother finally found her voice, but it wasn't the one I grew up with. It was high-pitched and hysterical. "We saved you. You were a mistake that would have ruined everything. We gave you a name, a home, and a life you never would have had with that woman." "A life?" I laughed, and the sound was hollow even to my own ears. "You gave me a front-row seat to your perfection while you treated me like the help. You invited me to stay in the shadows so I wouldn't stain your image. You didn't save me, Mom. You hid me. You were so afraid of the truth that you treated me like a burden for 30 years, all while knowing that every cent of the Davis wealth actually belonged to Evelyn's bloodline." The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, cleared his throat again. This time, he He didn't look mournful. He looked satisfied. Actually, he interjected, the will contains a very specific clause. Mrs. Vance was well aware of the unconventional circumstances of Arlette's upbringing. She spent years tracking the paper trail of that merger you mentioned. He turned to my father, whose face was now a sickly shade of gray. The $12 million isn't just an inheritance, Mr. Davis. It's a settlement. Evelyn Vance spent the last decade of her life buying back the debt and the shares your family used to build your current empire. As of 10 minutes ago, Arlette doesn't just own $12 million. She owns the deed to the house you're living in and 51% of the Davis Group. The room went cold. Claire let out a small, choked sound. My mother looked like she was about to faint. The people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small and invisible were suddenly realizing that they were standing in my house, breathing my air, and living on my dime. I leaned forward, looking at the three of them, the people I had spent my life trying to please. So, I said, my voice a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. Should we talk about those renunciation papers again? Or should we talk about how long you have to pack your bags? The room shifted from a battlefield to a theater of fake apologies. My mother, who only moments ago had called me a mistake, suddenly found her tears. She crossed the room, her hands reaching out as if to embrace me. Her face twisted into a mask of maternal concern. Arlette, darling, we were just in shock. You have to understand. We were only trying to protect you from a truth that was too heavy for a child to carry. Everything we did, the discipline, the distance, it was to make you strong. My sister Claire followed suit, her voice dropping the sharp edges. We're still family, Arlette. A piece of paper shouldn't change 30 years of history. Think of the holidays, the birthdays. You wouldn't really put your own parents on the street, would you? That's not who you are. I watched them with a detached kind of fascination. It was like watching actors forget their lines. They weren't apologizing for the lie. They were mourning their lifestyle. They didn't see a daughter. They saw a bank account they no longer had the password to. You're right, I said, watching the hope ignite in their eyes. It's not who I am, but it is who you taught me to be. You taught me that family is a business transaction, and right now, your business is bankrupt. The fallout was swifter than any of them expected. I didn't wait for them to process the news. By the next morning, I had a security team stationed at the Davis estate, my estate. I watched from the window of a sleek black car as Claire stood on the manicured lawn, surrounded by designer suitcases, screaming at a locksmith who was busy changing the codes to the front gate. The news of the Vance inheritance and the Davis Group takeover hit the local business journals by noon. My father's reputation, the one he had sold my soul to protect 30 years ago, vanished in a single headline. The merger that built their empire was exposed as a fraudulent scheme rooted in the theft of Evelyn Vance's life's work. I didn't feel the rush of joy I expected. Instead, I felt a quiet, cold peace. As I drove past them one last time, my father caught my eye through the glass. He looked small. He looked like the stranger I had always felt he was. I didn't roll down the window. I didn't offer a parting word. I just watched in the rearview mirror as the gates of their stolen paradise clicked shut, leaving them on the outside for the first time in their lives. A week later, I visited Evelyn's actual home, a quiet, sun-drenched cottage by the coast, miles away from the cold marble of the Davis estate. Inside, it wasn't a vault of money. It was a sanctuary of memory. On the mantel sat a single framed photo of me as a toddler, taken from a distance. She had been watching me for 30 years, unable to reach out because of the legal iron wall my parents had built around me. Sitting in her favorite armchair, I realized the $12 million wasn't just a fortune. It was 30 years of missed birthdays, graduations, and tears, converted into the only weapon she could give me to fight back. She didn't want me to just be rich. She wanted me to be free. I looked at my reflection in her hallway mirror, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see the Davis failure. I saw Evelyn's daughter. I saw a woman who was no longer a secret. People ask me if I regret destroying my family's life over a will. I tell them I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped holding up the walls of a house built on lies. My brother and sister are learning what it's like to work for a living, and my parents are living in a modest apartment, far from the social circles that once fueled their egos. They lost their status, but I found my soul. I learned that blood doesn't make a family. Truth does. And loyalty that requires you to stay silent while you're being erased isn't loyalty at all. It's a prison. Today, I run the company with transparency and heart, values the Davis name never knew. If you're sitting at a table where you aren't being heard, or where your worth is being traded for someone else's comfort, remember my story. You don't have to wait for an inheritance to reclaim your life. You just have to be brave enough to ask, should I tell them the truth, or do you want to?